All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to introduce you tonight to Dr. Julie Koehler, but before I do, I'd like to thank you all for being here and also to the Friends of the Belmont Public Library for helping make this event possible. My name is Amy Lousteau and I'm the Community Outreach Librarian here at the Belmont Public Library. I invite you all to get in touch with me with any questions or program ideas, and I'll put my email address and phone number in the chat. We also have a survey, if you wouldn't mind filling it out at the end of the program, and I'll put that link in as well. Just to note, we will be recording tonight's session, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, but feel free to put your questions in the chat as they occur to you, and we'll start with those. So, welcome to tonight's talk about the history of Cinderella. This talk was inspired by our summer reading theme of Tales and Tales, and we will be having another program in August on the other kind of tales involving animals. So that one's also for adults. We hope that you have been enjoying our weekly challenges for summer reading, just some fun ideas to keep you busy this summer. They can be found on Beanstack or through our website, and I'll put those links in the chat too. And now, without further ado, Dr. Julie Koehler is a lecturer of German and coordinator of the Basic German Language Sequence at Wayne State University. She received her PhD in Modern Languages from Wayne State University and holds a master's in German from Wayne and Masters of Education from the University of Michigan, where she also completed her bachelor's degree. Her research revolves around fairy tales told by German women in the 19th century, many of them sources for the Brothers Grimm collection. Her articles include The Persecuted History of Cinderella, a case for the oral tradition in Europe, in folklore journal Grammarië, and When the Inexhaustible Purse Runs Dry, Bettina von Armann's Tale of the Lucky Purse in the fairy tale journal Marvels and Tales. Her forthcoming book, Women Writing Wonder, an anthology of subversive 19th century British, French, and German fairy tales, is a collaborative project on which she is first author. Julie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Amy. I'm so happy to be here. It's such a fun thing that I get to do. So I'm thrilled to see that so many of you joined us tonight. This was great. I'm gonna start my screen share. And so just give me one moment. So those are my children. But here will be the slideshow. Let's see. There we go. Okay, can everyone see this okay? Yeah?
Looks good.
We'll get started. So the sort of center theme that I was reached out to about was Cinderella tales sort of around the world. And there are Cinderella tales around the world. But the question is it fair to call them Cinderella tales, or does that sort of place a Eurocentric emphasis on stories that maybe are unrelated to European tradition? And that's kind of the central focus of my talk today, is thinking, there's not really an answer to that question, but thinking critically about that idea. So we'll sort of start with what we would say are the oldest Cinderellas, and a couple of you sort of touched on them. There is a tale from antiquity, Rhodopis, and a tale from the Tang Dynasty of China, Yexian. So both of these tales predate anything we would call Cinderella by around 700 years for Yexian, and Rhodopis is obviously longer. So the question is, if we call these tales Cinderella tales, shouldn't we really be calling Cinderella tales Rhodopis tales, for example? Why do we take a much later European tradition and sort of slap it on to these ancient stories from a non-European context? And it's going to fit into some things a little bit later too, when we talk about sort of multicultural education in the classroom and how we frame that in relationship to ideas of what is folklore, what is a fairy tale. But just to briefly touch on these tales, so Rhodopis is interesting. You'll forgive me, I'm going to talk about so many tales. I do have some notes. in which an eagle snatches the sandal of a woman and carries it and drops it in the lap of a king, who is then enamored with the sandal and goes on a search to find what fits, and then marries this woman. So a question there would be, do we consider this a Cinderella tale? What makes it a Cinderella tale? Is it just a shoe, a search for someone who fits a shoe that we then marry? Does it matter that the sandal belongs to a maid as opposed to a noblewoman? Does it have to include, for instance, rising from a lower class state to a higher class state? Not totally clear, but we can sort of think about these structures, which folklorists think about all the time. What makes a certain kind of tale that tale? What makes a Cinderella tale a Cinderella tale? And under that context, does this fit into that structure? Is this a tale that maybe later European writers were familiar with? Is this a tale that sort of represents a moment in time when then oral tradition would have spread out from there? One thing to think about too, when we briefly, we'll get into it in the European tradition, is the idea of writing down oral vernacular folk tales. So tales that people were telling in their native languages, not in Latin, in the Middle Ages in Europe, is akin to the idea today of saying, oh, I'm going to go read this television script for Seinfeld because I love Seinfeld. I'm going to read this script. It's sort of ridiculous sounding, right? Like, no, you go watch Seinfeld, don't read the script. So we have so few records of things that people wrote down in that period until it sort of becomes vogue in the 1500s, as someone mentioned. So we can't go back in time and with our tape recorder and find out what people are saying. So this moment in time, for instance, in Egypt, could represent sort of a time when we saw something written down, or it could be a totally different, not affiliated tradition. The Xian story from China is interesting. It's a much longer, more complicated tale than, say, Perrault Cinderella or the Grimm Cinderella. There's a number of sort of side elements. There's relationships to festivals, there's magical fish. There is a golden slipper that's found, and it's particularly treasured for its small size. And so the idea is, can we find a woman whose foot is small enough to fit into this shoe, which I think is a cultural element that fits in to not just this tale, but when we get into the European tales, you'll see that the ugly stepsisters, their feet are too long or they're too wide, right? The smaller size foot that's treasured. It's interesting about this story. It's something that became very popular sort of in the early 20th century to refer back to this tale as an original Cinderella tale. But I have a colleague that I work with who focuses almost entirely on Chinese mythology, who had never heard of this story before she came to the United States and started working in a folklore department in the US. And someone was like, well, of course you'll know the story of the Chinese Cinderella. Well, no, she'd never heard of that story. So whether or not it's a story that holds the same sway in China today, or that has lasted in the way that our Cinderella is, or if it's just a story that we found that's a record of a period, is not totally clear to us. But moreover, if we're going to call anything as the title of the tale, we should be picking the oldest version. So in the early 20th century, they were sort of making the case for colonialism, for white supremacy, by saying that the folklore of Europe is universal, represents universal human truths. And that's why we can find evidence of it in this culture and this culture, because our literature is universal. That was sort of the overarching structure of some of these texts that collected tales in the late 19th, early 20th century. And Xian sort of falls into those collections. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not related to a longer tradition of Cinderella, but it's something we got to think about and be careful with. All right. So that we'll sort of jump in. Sorry, I started talking about a little bit to nationalism, colonialism, and fairy tales. So if we look at the Grimms, which is jumping ahead, we're going to go back. Don't worry, we'll go back to Italy where everything begins. But if we're talking about the Grimms and their collection, in particular from a folklore studies point of view. Their goal was to create a collection that represented German culture, because in their period, if you can look at the picture on the right, there wasn't really a Germany, right? There were the German states that were left over from the Holy Roman Empire. They were sort of coming together in different kinds of unions and then breaking apart and then coming together again. France was, of course, elbowing its way over and trying to take lands as well. And so the Grimms were making the case for a German state, a large German state encompassing all the lands that spoke German. And so they didn't just collect fairy tales, they collected sagas, they collected quotes and funny jokes. They also created the first German dictionary, the first German language dictionary that's still used today. I still use it today. And so they were really making this statement about German culture and trying to make a German nation. If we jump into France around the same period, France, of course, had been centralized for a really long time. And in France, what's popular in this same period, the 19th century, it's not the big national collection, it's regional collections. It's making a case for each region's individualized culture and their folklore. And so we see that these collections of tales have sometimes really political aspects to them. Even if we go into the 1950s, into Italo Calvino's collection of Italian folk tales, he's also making a case for sort of a unified Italian literature as he collects tales from a number of what would have been sort of Italian states within the Holy Roman Empire prior to those coming together. So that's sort of the background. It gets a little twisted. When I say nationalism, I don't, I mean it. So what the Grimms did, they were trying to create a German state, but it doesn't mean that other people didn't notice it later. The Nazis were very interested in Grimm's fairy tales and used their same tales to take their position of nationalism to the forefront. And they made it a law that they be taught in schools and really set them up on a high level of their sort of pure German literature in a different structure than the Grimms might have suspected would happen, 100 years in the future. But at the same period, so we have colonialism is rampant, and we have especially scholars from England who are collecting folktales in India, in what we would call the West Indies, and they're again using these collections. They're usually relying on translations. They're relying on translations that are poor, but they can't speak the languages. They don't know that. And they're sort of combining them and lumping different cultures, different nations into whole texts. But it's again a part of a larger project of sort of saying these tales, are a lot like our tales, and that's because we're a part of a universal structure. If we look into folklore studies, what's happening sort of early 20th century around the same time is something that's called tale type studies, which is still done today, which is what we do with Cinderella. Cinderella's tale type 513A, which is they assigned a number to each tale, and then they listed all the elements that made that tale what it is. It's called the persecuted heroine, which is why the title of my other article is Persecuted Heroine. And then they list the elements that sort of make that tale up, and then all the places it comes from. The problem with tale type studies is it's super Eurocentric. So all of the tale types sort of rely on a European original, and then they lump in all the other cultures sort of underneath that European structure. They also, lots of articles written how they're sort of a bit sexist. They often take sort of the male hero and call him the hero, but when there's a female hero, then they say that she's the wife or that she's the princess, then it's the same kind of language. And then there's the concept of the urtext, which is this idea that if we find all the tales, if we find all the Cinderella tales, right, and we find what is the same about all of them, then we can know the urtext being the original tale that was first told 1,000,000 years ago over a fire. Like if we can just find what all of these tales have, then we can find the urtext. But again, it's a flawed concept that we unfortunately will never know the urtext. Maybe there is no such thing as the urtext. But when we search for it, again, using a European structure or European construct and try to force everyone else's literature into it, that's when we're making a big mistake. So now we're going to actually get into the European tradition of Cinderella, and then we'll branch out as we go through. So the first one that's sort of another question mark is La Fresne. This is Marie de France. Forgive my French. This is often not considered a fairy tale because it's written in verse, and it's also it contains no magic. So it's written in verse. There's no magic, but there is a story in which a girl who should be noble is not noble and raised to be a servant. She falls in love with a man, and she uses a piece of cloth instead of a shoe, but basically that he falls in love with her when she's in disguise, and then they find this piece of cloth and he knows that it's her. Some people say it's the first European Cinderella. Some would say it maybe just represents that this kind of theme, this kind of idea of a man falls in love with a woman, loses the woman, but then, you know, finds her piece of cloth. Sometimes it's a ring, sometimes it's a shoe, and uses that to find her. That maybe that's the Urtext, right? That's the central theme, or maybe that's a theme that was around in a lot of tales and finds its way into Cinderella. Very hard for us to say. So that brings us to this. I'm jump back into folkloristics for a while. So in fairy tale studies, what's been proven fairly recently, about the last 15 years, is that a lot of the Italian tales, coming here from Basile, but also from other Italian writers, were printed in a way that the French writers, writing the 1690s, the Italian writers are in the 1400s, 1500s, that Perrault and Daunois, the French writers in the 1690s, could read the Italian tales, and that we found that some elements they basically kind of took verbatim out of the Italian tales into their tales. So if we could work backwards. So a lot of people would say, oh, the Grimms, that's the original folklore. But no, if you look at the Grimms, you see tons of their tales are so strongly related to Perrault and Daunois, the French authors, which were published authored works, not oral works, that their sources must have been greatly influenced by them. And they were. So they were, first of all, the Grimm sources were, many of them, educated, but also Perrault and Daunois became so popular in the 1700s and early 1800s that they were printed in what we call chapbooks. And these chapbooks were sort of cheap papers that printed the stories, and they spread throughout the countryside. And then they found their way back into oral tradition. So people would read them aloud and then start telling them. And then those stories actually are the ones that the Grimms collect later, a couple hundred years after the French wrote them. They're collecting them from oral sources. People are telling them the stories, they're not writing them, but they're influenced still by this French tradition. So then people say, oh, the French is original, but then we found the French were actually copying these early Italian writers. But in the case of Cinderella, ta-da, in the case of Cinderella, the Grimm tale and the Italian tale are extremely similar, and the French tales are completely different. And so the question is, well, where's the link there, right? If it doesn't go, the Italians write it down, the French copy them, it goes into oral literature, the Grimms pick it up. Is there a larger structure that we're missing, a larger oral structure of Cinderella stories, which fits into this next piece? So this isn't a story, but this is a sermon from 1580 called Der Eschenbrudel, which is the Cinderella in German. And it's about a woman. You see pictured here, a woman. This was printed in the 1500s. And she's cleaning, and it's that she should essentially work, listen to her superiors, be good, be pure, and in the end, God will reward her. So there's no magic, there's no slipper, but there is sort of someone who is put in a position of subservience and does what she's told, and in the end is rewarded. So we do have this sort of glimpse in the 1500s in Germany, or in Strasbourg actually, of what might have been a larger oral tradition. And so this is an example from the text of, it lists, these are the qualities of a Cinderella. So these are the qualities that it lists. And it's like, she has to do the washing, she has to do the cooking, she has to watch the cat, and so forth. So these are listing sort of her chores that she has to do. I'll come right back to that. So, and then within the same sermon, we hear the tale of a saint who is like very holy and prays all the time and so good, but she's made to be a servant by the jealous nuns in her convent. And then she's visited by a saint who sees her and recognizes, her worth. And the nuns take her and hide her back in the kitchen and say, she's not here, even though he had seen her earlier. And he goes, no, tell her to come out of the kitchen. She comes out and he says, you should all, follow her example. She's the purest of you all, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a saint story in this sermon that falls in line with some things that we think relate to Cinderella stories pretty clearly. And again, though we don't have a written Cinderella story with magic and all of the fun of the ball, we do have the idea that maybe there was the concept of a Cinderella before our first written version in Italy in the 1530s. So these are some other things, and I think I have it all in English. Yes, okay. So these are some other references to Cinderella in German in the 1500s, and they're mostly religious. So you'll see here in the middle one, Jacob, they're speaking of the story of Jacob and Esau, that he was the Cinderella, which means basically he was the noble one who was put upon to be the servant. You also see here Abel is being called the Cinderella. So there are many examples of biblical men who are called Cinderella in this period. And so it doesn't necessarily seem that the concept of a Cinderella was purely a female concept in this period. Though you do have this first quote, a foolish man will let his wife rule and be master, not that you should altogether look on her as a doormat, for she was taken out of the side of man, not out of his feet, to be a Cinderella. So the concept can be applied to women and men clearly, not just as necessarily as a servant, but as a servant that shouldn't be a servant, or that is purely serving and will be rewarded later for their service. There's a larger structure there. So that brings us to another German version. So forgive me because I'm realizing this is post Basile. So this is post the Italian version, but this is the a story that's often called the Earth Cow, das Erdkuhlein, and it comes from Martin Montanus's Wegkurze. So Martin Montanus is an early person writing down vernacular oral tradition. So in the 1500s, he's one of the first that we have in German tradition to do that. And he tells the story. It's really, whether or not it's a Cinderella story is very much up for discussion, because instead of a magical godmother or a magical tree, as we have in other traditions, you have a magical cow that gives this young girl dresses and cloth. The cow is then murdered by her jealous sister, and the girl buries the cow's horns in the earth, and out of that grows a tree with golden apples, and a prince comes, and his son is sick and he can only be cured by the golden apple, and then the Cinderella character can pluck the apple and he takes her off and marries her. So some things that might be similar, but again, maybe just motifs that are all popular in the same period in relationship to Cinderella stories. So now, finally, a true Cinderella story. It was called the Cat Cinderella in Basile in the 1530s. So this, across the board, people would say is the first example of a clear Cinderella tale written in a European country. And it's interesting because Cinderella has a stepmother that she doesn't care for, and her governess convinces her that she loves her like a mother, and if only this evil stepmother was out of the way, then Cinderella would be happy. So Cinderella calls her stepmother over to look into a trunk, and then slams the trunk on her head and murders her so that her governess can become her mother. And then her governess turns out to be just as evil a stepmother as the previous stepmother. So in that way, Basile's tale, well, first of all, it's very violent and bawdy, but in addition to that, we have sort of a tale of Cinderella's now serving and being good, being pious, sort of in penance for what she did to her initial stepmother. And what's unique, well, not unique, but what's unique from the French tradition in Basile's tale is that Cinderella has a magical tree, and the tree is the item that brings her dresses and her horses and sends her to the ball. So we have a tradition, and you'll see there's sort of competing traditions between whether there's a magical tree or a godmother that serves Cinderella. So that's Basile. And then if we jump ahead, here's Perrault, and several people mentioned Perrault. So you would know Perrault's tale. If I told it to you, you would say, duh, that's the story of Cinderella, because Disney chose Perrault's Cinderella for his film in 1950. So it remains the most well-known version in the United States, at least today, and throughout much of the world. That film had a huge impact on the concept of what Cinderella is. That being said, at the time that Disney made the film, Perrault's Cinderella, the Grimm Cinderella, and Donois, another French writer, Cinderella, were equally popular within the United States. If you look at like children's books or publications in newspapers or radio shows, you'll find that those all had sort of a place in what the concept of Cinderella was in that period. But Disney chooses Perrault's Cinderella, and that sort of becomes then what Cinderella is. And that's important because Perrault's Cinderella is sadly the most passive of all the Cinderellas, and the least likely to murder someone, unlike some of our other Cinderellas. So, but Disney, he knew what he was doing. He was choosing a post-war Cinderella. He wanted someone who, like a Donna Reed character, someone who liked to work, who liked to keep house, who cared for the little mice and so forth. And so Perrault's Cinderella fit in to his what he wanted to do more clearly. Then we can look at Donois. So Donois tells a version of Cinderella at the same period as Perrault. She and Perrault are writing at the same time. She's a part of a community of scholars, writers, nobles who get together in salons and tell fairy stories for fun, and then they start to publish them. And it's basically all women, and then there's Perrault. But the women's stories are very long, and Perrault's stories are very short. And so later on, Perrault's stories sort of make their way easier into oral tradition because they're just shorter to tell, but also for reasons of the patriarchy. Perrault's stories become something that children read in school really early on, something that students work with as they practice translation or as they practice transcribing French letters. So Perrault sort of becomes a standardized version in the school. So Donois remains popular, not just in France, in England, in the US, sort of in the Western world through the 50s. You find examples of Donois tales being told around here, but then they sort of fall out of favor. But Finette Cendrillon, as it's called in French, Finette Cinderella, is great because Finette is very active. She's a super heroine. And my favorite part of this tale, I'm just making sure that I get this right. So she finds an acorn, she plants the acorn, it grows into a tree, and she puts on beautiful dresses that her jealous sister take away and turn into rags. And so she finds her way as she runs away from them to an ogre's castle, and the ogre wants to eat her and her sisters. But the ogress persuades them to sort of wait a night. And this is sort of a common theme, but while the ogress and the ogre sleep, hold on, I'm missing the thing. Yeah, the ogre decides that he does want to eat them, and Finette tricks the ogre into the oven, burns into cinders, and then she and her sisters run away. So we have another example of a Cinderella who is active, who is not afraid to kill to get what she wants, and in this case is a little bit more noble and heroic than Cat Cinderella. But another story that was very popular, it's not like it's an unknown tale, sort of throughout the period. So Grimm's were really familiar with it, even into the early 20th century in the US, you'll see examples of it. Okay, so that brings us to the Grimm. Sorry, those are out of order. So the Brothers Grimm I mentioned briefly before, their goal, right, was to establish a German nation. And this is an example. They recorded all of the versions of the word Cinderella in different German dialects. So these are all the words that they found for Cinderella in German dialects in the period. And again, for them, that's a way of saying, sure, we all speak different dialects, but we all tell Cinderella, right? That's all of our story, right? And they specifically took things out of Cinderella that seemed too French because they were making the argument that it was German. And this was their one of their sources, Dorothea Feeman, who they praised and sort of placed in the centerpiece of their book. This was actually placed in the frontispiece of their book, her image. Because most of their sources were young, educated women, many of them their friends or their friends' sisters. But Dorothea Feeman was one of their actual peasant sources who really told stories orally, and they sort of acted like she told most of the collection. But she did tell them a version of Cinderella. And if we look at her version of Cinderella, it aligns in some ways to Perrault's story. So for instance, she has the element of midnight being the time, you know, that Cinderella has to rush home or everything will fall to pieces. And in other German traditions, we don't see a reference to midnight. So that's something that Grimm's made sure to take out. After the first edition, they removed that reference to midnight. They also removed words that she had used that had a French origin. So she used a word for bottle that was sort of the French word for bottle, but was also known in German, but they replaced that with a more Germanic term for bottle. And so they're taking these tales and sort of stripping them of their intercultural elements and making sure that everyone knows these are super German. But one thing that Dorothea Feeman and the German tales all had in common, which I realize I have back here, is the magical tree. So whereas there is a godmother in Don Juan, there's a godmother in Perrault, there's a magical tree in Basile, and there's a magical tree in the Grimms. And these examples of illustrations from the 20s and 30s were published in English texts here in the US. So just again to demonstrate that the Grimm tale had a popularity here in the US leading up to the period that Disney made his film. And so children would have been familiar with both versions. And you see that the slippers and the dresses that's falling out of the tree, and also the birds are bringing things to Cinderella, which is another important element. All right, so this also bringing back trees. If we jump all the way back to Marie de France, her two sisters were named after the ash tree and the hazelnut tree. And we see in the Grimm tradition that the tree that grows is often either an ash tree or a hazelnut tree. And there's another version that we'll talk about later that's called the Three Hazelnuts of Cinderella. So these references specifically to certain types of trees goes back to that 1100s piece from Marie de France. And maybe again raises the question of a much larger tradition than we're able to know just from these written sources, that people may have been telling all kinds of versions of this story or not. It's not clear, but we have these sort of little hints as we go through. Another thing that happens in the German Cinderella is that she buries her mother at the base of a tree and waters the tree with her tears, which is in some ways similar to what happens in the earth cow. She buries the horns of the cow, waters it with her tears, and a tree grows out of it, a magical tree. And that's a known tradition in Germany to plant things by graves, to plant trees, or like this is a German graveyard. This is like a typical German graveyard. You have these plots that are sort of built out with flowers or little trees or little bushes that people come and care for. So that's a tradition going back long before the Grimms that might fit into that same motif of the tree. Why is the tree, for instance, again, in the German tale and the Italian tale, but not in the tradition, the French tradition that usually bridges those two groups together. All right, so another version, Vasilisa the Beautiful from the 1880s. I like this version. So she interacts with Baba Yaga, you may be familiar with, which is a sort of Russian trickster witch. And when she returns home from Baba Yaga's hut, she has this, which you see here, the skull lamp. And she walks in to find her mother or stepmother and sister, and the skull's eyes like basically turn into lasers and burn her mother and sister alive, and they're just ashes. And then she packs up and leaves and moves to town and becomes a famous seamstress, and that's how she meets the king. So another example of Cinderella sort of taking out her enemies in a way that we don't see in the Perrault story, unfortunately. All right. So that brings us to early film, and now I'm going to check my time. Okay, because I have a couple of clips, and I'm not sure how much time I'll have, but I do want to talk about Cinderella in film because it's hugely important. So one of the main things is that the earliest films, some of the earliest films that we have on record were fairy tale films, mostly from Georges Méliès, but he's not the only one who did them. So we're not even into the 20th century here. At the end of the 19th century, we are making fairy tale films. And specifically because you can do things in films that you can't do in theater. So Méliès is the master of film trickery and using different sort of motives to sort of make magic happen, right? What we still call today movie magic, right? That's exactly what they were thinking about right at the beginning of film. Now we can display magic in a way we couldn't do before on the stage. We'll do it in film. And so Cinderella as a film was produced in 1899. Another really important Cinderella tale comes from a German filmmaker, Lotte Reiniger, in the 20s. She created silhouette films. You see this here, the silhouette of Cinderella. And she also created arguably the first feature-length animated film in the 1920s. It wasn't Cinderella, it was Prince Ahmed. But Disney is often credited with creating the first feature-length fairy tale animated film in the with Snow White in the 30s. But people argue how long is a feature film is the argument. For a film's about an hour. And also people would argue that silhouettes aren't animation, and that's also up for debate. But these are two really important filmmakers. They chose to make films of Cinderella, and they chose to use their unique art to tell this story. And I think that tells you that right from the beginning, Cinderella was going to have a place in film moving forward. And I don't know if we have enough time. I think I will show a brief, let's see if this works, if I can show a brief thing here. You know what, I'm gonna see. We could show Méliès. Let's see if it goes. All right, so forgive me. Hopefully this plays for you. All right, it's not the best quality, but here I'm gonna jump ahead. She's returned from the ball. This is my favorite part. The clocks are taunting her. That's just an example of Cinderella tale from one of the very earliest fairy tale films. I'll keep going, which sort of brings me now into the US. So we actually have some Cinderella stories that were published as early as the 19th century, as early as like the 1860s. We have Cinderella tales being published in the US. They do not contain magic. They do contain an emphasis on work, primarily. And they are tongue-in-cheek. They assume that the reader has a familiarity. So, for example, this woman she's arguing with a man who she loves, but they won't admit that they love each other. And she goes to walk away, and he takes his shoe and throws it at her, and it falls, and she turns around and picks up the shoe and returns it to his foot, and that's the ending. So we have it's called I think it's called a new Cinderella. So we have the idea that all of Americans in the 19th century already knew Cinderella, so they know what they're playing with. There's another version where there's a woman in a working house. The author doesn't give their title. The author's name is listed just as working girl. And she's sort of saved by working hard and being recognized by a wealthier man who rescues her from the workhouse. Again, neither of these have any elements of magic. There's no magic fairy godmother. There's no magic tree. So what makes them Cinderella stories? Is it the shoe? Is it the change in financial status? As we come into the United States, especially in relationship to sports in the 20th century, a new idea comes out. Cinderella is what we would call the underdog, right? So Cinderella, we see this often, especially with the NCAA tournaments, right? Cinderella wears sneakers. And so she, or the team that is least likely to win, makes it happen. They're the Cinderella story. Similarly, the Cinderella Man, and you also see references here to ideas that Cinderella has to work, right? This is significantly different from where Cinderella comes from. So we think of the vast majority of Cinderella tales, Cinderella is not the underdog, the poor woman who was saved by a rich man. She's a noble woman who is made to act as a servant and then is raised back up to her noble status, her rightful status at the end, especially in the French tales, especially in Perrault and Dolonois. That is the main theme, right? That her nobility shines through even when she's in rags. And so, of course, she's raised back up to that status at the end of the story, what we call a restoration tale. Someone who is high, goes low, comes back high, restoration. Whereas in the US, it's totally been rebranded as a rise tale. A rise tale is someone who comes from a low spot and ends at a high spot. And that fits much better into the American concept of our value system, right? Is to have someone who works hard and succeeds and makes their way in the world and then is rewarded, than the European concept of basically maintaining nobility that was sort of really important to those 17th century French writers. Just an interesting contrast of how we look at Cinderella in the US today. Okay, so again, running out of time, but real quick. So this, I don't know if I briefly have time to talk about this, probably. Just an example of two really powerful Cinderella film franchises. So we have Disney Cinderella in the 50s, which we all know, so not, it's really important. Then we have something called the Three Hazelnuts for Cinderella, which is a film that was made between East Germany and the Czech Republic, which wasn't the Czech Republic then, but during sort of communism. So they made this film together, and it's based on a story from a Czech female writer from the 19th century. And a lot of fairy tale films were made in East Germany in this period, and it's a constant balance. They had the same goal as the Grimms and as Hitler, that they wanted to show their great German nation, right? They wanted to show the German culture, but they didn't want people to be rewarded with wealth. They wanted to show people who worked hard, and they also wanted to show things like gender equality. They wanted to show things like the ills of capitalism and the ills of the monarchy, and they display all of these in the fairy tale films sort of very precariously. But this film, which was made in East Germany, has sort of exploded across Europe. It is shown every year at Christmas. There are just hundreds of traditions around sitting down with your family to watch this film every year at Christmas in many, many European nations, not just Germany and the Czech Republic, but all over. It's very, very well known. And so it has some of the power that Disney Cinderella has in the European framework. And I mentioned this because it's really different from Disney Cinderella. And the Cinderella character is very, she's very stubborn. She shoots better than the prince. She runs faster than the prince. And I find it interesting, if I have 2 seconds, to show the ending of this film, which is really different from the way that Disney's film ends. And so I'll really quickly.
Wir sollten zurückreiten. Im Schloss wird man sich schon Sorgen machen.
So, the prince has not been able to find her. He has tried to slip her on other people and it hasn't fit, and he's given up. And he decides to come back one more time to the town to see if maybe he'll find her. But he's already tried it on everyone else. And now this is where we're at.
Oh. Guck mal, das White.
los?
Bringst du mir meinen Schuh wieder? Und ich gebe dir den Ring für den König der Jagd.
Der gehört dir doch.
Kannst du mir jetzt mein Rätsel beantworten? Die Wangen sind mit Asche beschmutzt, aber der Schornsteinfeger ist es nicht.
Das war im Wald. Das kleine Mädchen.
Mhm. Ein Hütchen mit Feder, die Armbrust über der Schulter, aber ein Jäger ist es nicht.
Das bist auch du gewesen? Der Zauberschütze auf der Jagd?
Mhm. Ein silbergewirktes Kleid mit Schleppe zum Ball, aber eine Prinzessin ist es nicht, mein holder Herr. Wer ist das? Unser Aschenbrödel!
Unser Aschenbrödel! Und auch meins. Wenn du mich willst.
Okay, I want to run out of time. But so here the Cinderella character has all the power. She's even so much higher than him when she comes in. She comes in her beautiful dress, not in her smudged, wear. And she tells him right out, right? I outshot you, I outran you. I am, the woman of all of those moments. And then he asks her if she will have him. None of these things happen in the Disney version. It's at the end assumed that they're off and they're married. So another example of a tale that has, or film that has a wide popularity, but follows sort of a different value structure than Disney. Okay, and we're running out of time. Real quick. So just these are some cool horror and suspense films that came out in the 21st century that focus in particular. The first one, Cinderella from South Korea, is a lot about plastic surgery and the obsession with having perfection, which fits into a lot of Cinderella's tradition. The Grimms cut off the sisters' feet to make them fit. But even in many film versions, we have, the stepsisters are too skinny or too fat, and Cinderella's perfect. And the Cinderella addiction, which just came out this year, also plays on some of those themes sort of in an ugly way, looking at sort of women waiting to be rescued and then being sick of being subservient and sort of taking things into their own hands. It's a murder story. So some examples of the way themes have been played on around the world, but in a totally new structure and totally new way of looking at it. And then more time. So I have almost enough time to talk about this, which brings us back to my initial point. There's a great article that I've just put here, Black Cinderella, Multicultural Literature and School Curriculum, about African tales that are branded as Cinderella stories in 20th century school curriculums so that they can tell Cinderella stories from around the world. And these tales, just like Isian, just like Rodolphus, they have things in common with Cinderella, but their authors don't call them Cinderella stories. They aren't written to be necessarily Cinderella stories. And her argument is, why can't these just be great folk tales that students should hear? Why do they have to fit into the Eurocentric box? Why can't we say, here's a whole other folk tradition unrelated to Europe that also has, strong female characters, or tells the story of a man falling in love with a woman and finding her later. The last example, A Caribbean Cinderella, actually is a subversive version of Perrault's tale, told from a Caribbean perspective. And in that case, yes, it does make sense to bring in the Cinderella context, but for the first two, maybe not. But there is a Black Cinderella, Cinderella from 1997, Marshall's Hammerstein, that has had a huge effect also on American culture that doesn't get brought up that often. But I will tell you, every single term that I teach Cinderella, I have a student of color come up to me and say that this film meant so much to them as a child, because this film represents the most beautiful woman in the world. And here this picture is from the Stepsisters' Lament, where they're listing all the ways that Cinderella is the most beautiful of all, but still that the prince should marry them instead. But the most beautiful woman in the world here is the Black woman, right? And the fairy godmother with all the power and all the magic is the Black woman. And that carries a lot of power for children. Children see these films, they see Disney Cinderella, they wear the dresses, and having an example that flips that script for them is really important. It's just as important to honor these other tales and their own unique traditions But that doesn't mean that Cinderella has to always be European, right? It's a larger, complicated structure. A really famous folklore scholar, Christina Bacchialega, she calls it the fairy tale web, right? We have all of these things and they intersect and they have different points where they touch, but it's much more complicated than a straight line or even a circle. It's a web. And that's what's represented in these studies, sort of Cinderella around the world. I know I've gone over time, but that is it. Thank you all so much. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was fantastic. And I think that slide that you had with the Korean and the horror, I think that's going to give me nightmares.
If I showed the clip, it would have given me nightmares.
Please, I'm glad you did not show a clip. I'm a lightweight. So I'm just going to pop the program feedback form in the chat while we're thinking of questions. If you have any, feel free to unmute or raise your hand, or just type it in the chat if you like. And I have a couple questions to kick us off since there weren't any in the chat yet. So to answer your question that you were sort of posing near the end there, like why can't we just present these tales as all part of a web? Well, originally I think that you posed it as, you know, why can't we just appreciate them for what they are and not try to connect them? But I think I like to think that we are critical readers and we will make these connections in our brains, and it is helpful to have a sort of more guided discussion, but you know, maybe without the Eurocentric aspect of it. Let's see. I also just thought it was very interesting that the original story was a fall and then a rise back to the original position of nobility. I do think that's, you make a good point that that's a very American thing to just be like a rags to riches, you know, turn of the century kind of.
That's the tale, right? That's what everyone loves. But it also demonstrates that, again, even if we're just talking about the Eurocentric structure, whether you're an American saying that's a Cinderella story or you're a German saying that's a Cinderella story, you're not necessarily talking about the same thing. It's not apples to apples, right? So, you know, what we call a socio-historical structure, it's important to sort of think about where these things come from and what that culture was sort of getting at.
Yes, and there's a comment from Gail, a fascinating breadth of the history. And Gail, yes, I will send you the program feedback form. I will do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Gail.
Any other comments? I see a couple people had to go. It's just about 8 o'clock.
No, I went too long. I'm sorry.
No, it was fascinating. It was great to see the clips too. I don't know if you can see Millie's comment. Really enjoyed this.
Thank you, Millie.
On culture, history, and worldview, whenever we plug in. Yeah. I also wanted to say, I think Georges Méliès is mentioned in The Invention of Hugo Cabret, which is a sort of graphic novel / novel. It's like a crossover kids book, which is really phenomenal. It's illustrated by Brian Selznick. And it's just pencil and paper or maybe charcoal or something, but it's just phenomenal instructions, and half the illustrations and half of the story is told in illustrations. So if you have a chance to check it out, it looks intimidating. It's like this big, but because half of it is illustrations. Yeah. It goes pretty fast. So check that out. I'll put the title in the chat.
I'm familiar with the title, but I've never even seen it. But I had someone else mention it to me recently. So.
Oh yeah, you should. You haven't read the book?
I haven't read it. No. Yeah. But I've had it told. You're not the first to be like, hey, you should check this out. So I will take it.
Excellent. And they made it into a movie a few years ago. Okay, so there's a question from Millie. Do you make any connection with the princess thing, its popularity with young girls?
That's a great question. Certainly in the US, the princess element is big. So even in the 19th century, when they were telling all the versions that were not magical, there was like a big obsession with royalty, especially British royalty, and a lot of sort of illustrated versions of Cinderella focused so heavily on her dress. And also we've seen examples that aligns with some of the dress of royalty in the period. So even in the 19th century, it looked like sort of young girls in the US were wishing they could be princesses, even in a democratic state. So that does seem to be an early thing that's really popular, and something certainly that Disney capitalized on by making multiple princess films in a row. So, you know, what we call the classic fairy tales, a lot of them have princesses, a number of them don't, maybe 50% of them don't, but Disney likes to tell the princess ones, and that was part of their larger structure of selling things, I think. So that becomes really ingrained across the US. And there's a big argument as to whether or not it matters that there's other Cinderellas who are, oh, thank you. Jeez. Other Cinderellas that are more active heroines, because children today are just seeing the passive one. So there's a lot of writing about, like, who cares about these old tales where she's active? They're not hearing those tales. They're hearing tales where she's passive. And so that's a big sort of ongoing discussion as to whether or not we should focus on the effect of fairy tales on kids today, or look at that big broader history and think about the character of Cinderella as having many different facets.
All right, and another question. Thank you and goodbye. And then another question. What about happily ever after, like the memes of Cinderella as an alcoholic, angry ex, etc.? I have not seen those memes.
That is such a great point. And that's something we see. Actually, there's a great 19th century British story where an author is like walking in the woods and happens on a castle where like all of the fairy tale people live, and a lot of the princesses, including Cinderella, are like very cynical, very angry, drunk, or some of them can't walk anymore because they are just lazy. So that's an early theme that people are thinking about, is whether or not happily ever after is realistic. There's also a big argument in Cinderella stories. Does she want to be married? Does she fall in love, or does she just need to get out of there? She's in basically an abusive situation, and she's found a way out of that situation. Many of the early variants do not mention love. And so maybe it's just the story of a woman doing what she needs to do to get out of a bad situation. And so that's another piece I think that plays into that. But yeah, especially in the 70s, you see a lot of feminist retellings of Cinderella where she's angry or frustrated, or in a loveless marriage, and so forth. So yeah, that's an ongoing and important element.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you everyone for attending. And have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. This was so fun. Bye.